This is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Apparently, it all began with a skinny dip as the sun began to sink after a beautiful hot spring day. Ralph Entwhistle, a 24-year-old convict with a life sentence, stripped off his clothes and dived into the cool water of the Macquarie River. Coming up for air, he flicked his sandy blonde hair out of his grey eyes and felt the intense heat of the day slowly leave his body. It was November 1829. Ralph was assigned to a local landowner in Bathurst named John Liscombe. Liscombe had asked Ralph to do one final task before he got his ticket of leave. He was to deliver a bullock dray full of wool bales to Sydney. It would be a mammoth journey, full of dangers. It was a 483-kilometre round trip over the Blue Mountains on dusty dirt roads. He had another convict with him for help, and they had teamed up with another 2 convicts from a neighbouring farm who were also delivering a load of wool. After a day riding on the wooden dray, feeling every bump in the road, the 4 convict men floated in the water and felt their weary bodies relax. That was until their state of bliss was interrupted by a rustling coming from the banks of the Macquarie River. They turned to the sound of the clopping of the hooves and spotted Governor Darling's convoy further up the river at the crossing. The men ducked behind some reeds and were confident that they hadn't been spotted in their naked state. They watched as the Governor's convoy were met by Bathurst Police Magistrate Thomas Evenden. They observed the exchange, and once both parties had moved on, they got out of the river, dressed, and made camp. What they didn't know was that they had been spotted by Thomas Evenden. After his exchange with the Governor, Evenden had returned to Bathurst Police Station and sent some officers out to arrest the convicts. Ralph and his companions were thrown into Bathurst jail, but they hadn't broken any law. They had gone for their swim after they had finished a hard day of work, in their own free time. But Evenden was hell-bent on teaching them a lesson. Perhaps he felt they had embarrassed him in front of the Governor. He ordered them to be flogged with the cat of 9 tails. Each man was to be lashed 50 times across their backs. It was a particularly savage punishment, wildly out of proportion for the offence. Each man was tied to a flogging triangle with their arms high above their heads, with their feet just touching the ground. This was highly unusual in itself. This was done so the skin was taut and their back would easily tear open with each lash. Any hope of getting his ticket of leave was also gone. He was returned to Liscombe with a growing, festering hatred for the unfair, inhumane convict system. As the months passed, he began planning his escape. In September 1830, he and 4 other convict men assigned to Liscombe stole away from the farm and headed to a neighbouring property. There they enlisted more fellow convicts. They grabbed any firearms they could get their hands on and went from farm to farm enticing other convicts to join them. It wasn't long before their numbers had grown to 80 men, and along the way they had stolen more firearms, food, spirits, and horses. With such a large force supporting them, Entwhistle felt it was time to confront his real target, Thomas Evenden. He had been dreaming of this moment since the day he was unfairly locked up in Bathurst's tiny, filthy jail. Evenden's farm was located 10 miles out of Bathurst. When they arrived, the men took their positions around the farmhouse and Entwhistle called for Evenden to come out. Much to his disappointment, Evenden wasn't home. Entwhistle convinced all the convicts assigned to Evenden to join their gang, But the overseer, John Greenwood, refused. Pointing their pistols and muskets at him, Entwhistle and his gang strongly suggested that he join them or else. Greenwood wasn't fazed in the slightest and very arrogantly ripped open his shirt, baring his chest, and told them that they weren't game enough to shoot him. At that moment, both Entwhistle and William Gaham fired at Greenwood, both hitting him in the chest. Greenwood staggered back, calling out, quote, "Oh Lord," end quote, and turned to go back into the house, and Michael Kearney finished him off by shooting him in the back. There was no going back now. They were murderers and would be hanged if caught. The gang ransacked the property and left. The citizens of Bathurst were terrified of the growing gang. On Monday, the 27th of September, a meeting was held at the local courthouse so the people of Bathurst could discuss the situation and come up with a plan of action. They called for people to volunteer to fight the gang, and about a dozen men stepped forward. W.H. Souter was appointed to lead the group. Souter sought out the assistance of two native men that he knew, who were able to track the gang. According to the Sydney Gazette, the Ribbon Gang, as they were now known, were encamped at Warragamba River. It was thought that they had been named the Ribbon Gang because of the ribbons that dangled down from Entwhistle's cabbage tree hat, but it is more likely a reference to the Ribbon Men that were a secret society made up of a band of urban rebels that caused riots in Ireland in response to cruel masters. On the Tuesday, when the sun was going down, the gang were located. Souter and his men planned to surround their camp and attack in the dead of night when the gang was sound asleep. But as a small party crept around the rear of the gang, one slipped and sent a rock crashing down, alerting the outlaws. The gang instantly leapt into action, ducking behind trees and sending a volley of gunfire towards the volunteers. The volunteers retaliated and the battle continued for about an hour. During that time, someone in the gang had mistaken Souter as Evenden and called out to him, taunting that they would kill him. One gang member came dangerously close to making that a reality when he fired his musket and the ball whistled past Souter's ear, brushing his cheek and flying through his hair. When the volunteers were nearly all out of ammunition and night was fast approaching, Souter decided it was time to retreat and regroup. As soon as they were safely away from the gang's encampment, Souter penned a letter to Major Macpherson describing what had transpired. It was dispatched immediately, and when received, another party was sent for reinforcement. Souter and his men made camp, waiting for the response, and the following night were met with a storm. When they awoke the next day, everything was soaked, and most of their horses had taken off. Whilst looking for their horses, they came across Lieutenant Brown of the Mounted Police and his men sent out to aid them. Lieutenant Brown was ready to go into battle against the gang. Since the first battle, the Ribbon Gang had found a more secure location and were prepared to fight. Hundreds of shots were fired, with 2 of Lieutenant Brown's men shot and 5 horses were killed. The gang had an abundance of ammunition at their hands and were just too strong in numbers and arms to beat. If Souter and Lieutenant Brown and their men had joined forces and attacked together, they probably could have taken the gang, but separately the 2 units were too weak to take on such a large band of outlaws. Around this time, Entwhistle realised that many of the convict men in his gang had joined him out of fear and could disperse at any time. The last thing he wanted was for the group to splinter during a battle. He wanted loyal men who had his back, so he told everyone that they could freely leave and would come to no harm. Most of the men abandoned him. which left a core group of about 14 committed followers. The Ribbon Gang continued to pillage and plunder the area of Bathurst and recruit more volunteer convicts. It is believed that they made the Abercrombie Caves their headquarters, using different parts of the huge caves for their camp, their horses, and their supplies. Meanwhile, Captain Walpole and the 39th Regiment were marching up from Sydney, and Lieutenant McAllister of the 48th Mounted Police were coming from Goulburn Plains to offer their assistance to the cause. When both parties arrived, they joined forces and began following the gang's last movements. When Lieutenant McAllister and Captain Walpole discovered the gang camped on the banks of the River Lachlan, they immediately rained down gunfire upon them. Hundreds of shots were fired from both sides, and McAllister was shot and badly wounded in his thigh. By the end of the day, men on both sides were seriously wounded. Constable Geary, in particular, was severely injured, and a horse had been shot dead. Despite being well armed, the remainder of the Ribbon Gang knew that continuing was futile. Had they been able to attract bigger numbers of loyal convicts into their gang, it would have been a very different story. The following morning, the 12 remaining men reluctantly surrendered to Captain Walpole. The Ribbon Gang members were taken into custody. The Bathurst Rebellion was over. They were escorted back to Bathurst Jail, but 2 of the men died before reaching it. The 10 men who had been taken into custody soon had their day in court. They were tried in Bathurst Courthouse by a special commission before His Honour the Chief Justice of New South Wales, Francis Forbes, and a jury made up of military officers. Ralph Entwhistle, William Gahan, Michael Kearney, Patrick Gleeson, Thomas Dunn, and John Shepherd were all convicted of the murder of John Greenwood and sentenced to be hanged. The remaining members of the gang, Robert Webster, James Driver, Dominic Davey, and John Kenny, were charged with stealing from farmhouses and sentenced to death. On the 2nd of November 1830, the Ribbon Boys were led to a large scaffold that had been erected in the centre of the town of Bathurst, which was to serve as their gallows. Ralph Entwhistle and the 5 others that were convicted of murder were hanged first, followed by the remaining 4 men convicted of stealing. Their bodies were put on public display for a time, perhaps as a warning. When they were finally taken down, they were buried in 2 mass graves nearby. The street where they were hanged is now known as Ribbon Gang Lane. When I researched this story, I couldn't find any primary sources to back up the part about the skinny dip or the flogging that Ralph and his mates received. This part of the story has been repeatedly told over the years, but I just couldn't find any evidence of it. That's not to say it doesn't exist, and may even be a story that has been passed down from generation to generation. If you have better luck than me finding primary sources, I'd love to hear from you. So that was the last episode of Season 3. I hope you've enjoyed it. I will be taking a break to work on my next book. If you want to learn more about convicts, head to the Convict Australia Facebook group or Instagram page, or sign up to Patreon and receive the Convict Australia monthly newsletter, which will tell you all about the new released books, exhibitions, tours, talks, and some useful links to help you research your convict ancestors. You can also purchase a copy of my book, Convict Sydney, The Real Life Stories of 32 Prisoners. All the links are in the show notes. Till next time. Thank you for listening to the Convict Australia podcast. If you'd like to show your appreciation and get more involved, there are a number of ways you can. The first is by signing up to Convict Australia on Patreon, and you will get some perks like the Convict Australia Newsletter. Secondly, leave a review and tell your friends and family. This really does make a huge difference. And lastly, join the Facebook and Instagram group Convict Australia. All the links I've mentioned will be in the show notes. Thank you again. Till next time.